Today's episode of Chalk Talk, we're going to be talking about training adaptations, and in more layman's terms, where we hear a lot from our students and athletes looking to know is how long does it take to make gains? So we're going to dive into a topic that we often hear questions on, especially from our students and athletes that are looking to see the difference in the work that they're putting in. We have Coach Brez on another EDU style podcast, so we'll go ahead and jump in. This is Chalk Talk, presented by Platform. Let's go. All right, welcome back to another EDU style episode with Coach Brez. We are excited to be talking about this one, and it was one that kind of like clicked in my head over the weekend because I am just getting into a new swim season and with a new group of students and a new group of athletes, and they're kind of chomping at the bit of waiting for that adaptation to kick in and the gains to kick in. And we all know it. We probably hear it all the time of, well, how long is it going to take for me to see a difference? And obviously, we're going to probably get into a lot of those different buckets, whether we're talking about strength or speed or conditioning or power, but everybody sort of wants to see like the results. And we live in this kind of fast-paced world where results... Instant gratification comes quickly. And a lot of this, it's not an overnight fix. We're going to be talking about, understanding how long it takes to actually make those changes. So when I brought this topic to you, where did your head go and where did you start to kind of look for the research and the kind of data and information in terms of adaptations themselves?
Yeah, I was glad you brought it up because it's something that without a doubt, I think every person, let alone students and athletes, are heavily invested in the answer, knowing what's going to come from hard work and when. And, it's something that I think I've probably taken for granted, just understanding that, it takes time, and never really diving into the hard and fast, call it specifics of specific training adaptation windows per training goal, training approach, etc. So I thought it was unique, and I just kind of took a look at what was available in terms of research and common convention and anecdotal evidence. I will say there's a few caveats before we dive into answering some of those larger questions, and the first is that as much as we will kind of try to speak with clear, somewhat general, but black and white answers to these questions, one, there isn't actually a whole lot of research that looks at if I'm looking for X, I do any sort of Y, it will take this long. And
right.
That doesn't necessarily happen. It's usually a kind of an ancillary result of doing studies based for other things.
And I think that also the reason why I thought of it is you do see a lot of articles and things like that of how to get a six-pack in 6 weeks.
Yes.
How to, tone your arms in 80 days. They do, because they're selling it, like we often talk about, yes. promote it. But what you're almost getting at is there's not a direct, it's not actually 6 weeks, it's 8 weeks or 12 weeks. A lot of it is somewhat fluid based off of a lot of different factors that go into an individual training.
Well, yeah, that's what we don't have any true data that says it's this much time for this type of goal, and not least of which because it is entirely dependent on the individual and the circumstances surrounding that individual, the experience level of the individual, how consistent they are in whatever training they do. What is the training? Is it an effective program?
Yeah.
Is it training with intent for a specific goal? Are you, for strength, are you using progressive overload, or are you just doing the same thing over and over and over again? So there's a lot of caveats to this, but I think if we understand that it's a bit fluid and it's a bit individual, we can kind of give some blanket statements to give you an idea of if you are targeted, if you are consistent, and you are searching for one particular result or a number of results, what it might take to achieve those on average.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and also just in consideration of the wide gamut of people of, some people are going to see adaptations or changes or differences probably in a shorter window if they've been doing next to nothing, right? If someone gets off the couch for the first time in a year and starts doing things, they might see some more noticeable changes than if someone who lives a generally active lifestyle and is now trying to move the needle a little bit further. So there's all sorts of those different caveats, like you said, and understanding that, sometimes for a completely, new person, newbie, that's picking up weights for the first time, 4 to 6 weeks, they might see a little bit difference than someone who's lifted for 8 years and does, some sort of regimen or routine. So I think all those things are fair. And for us in this purpose, we'll kind of take it, like you said, sort of step by step. There's obviously a lot of overlap, but as we often do, we'll kind of look at each bucket, and we typically start with strength or strength and power. So why don't we go there first if that makes the most sense, and we can break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. And strength's kind of maybe the more obvious one. It's actually a natural segue from what you just mentioned in regards to experience. So bottom line, to basically begin the answer to this question, but will serve as the answer to almost all of the questions, is it takes time. We're talking matters of weeks and months, not days. So when we're talking about strength, the literal sense of amount of force produced by your muscles upon the world, you're going to look at kind of two windows of adaptation. And then the first that might happen between, call it 4 and 8 weeks, you will see strength gain, the ability to exert more force, lift heavier weight. The funny thing is, though, all of those gains will happen because of neuromuscular adaptation. So why I'm saying this is I want to make sure we divorce very early and often that your muscles aren't actually changing in size, shape, or structure of any kind. What's happening is your muscles are actually, your brain is learning how to utilize your muscles more effectively in greater totality and with better coordination so that you can lift the same weight easier. You are unlocking the muscle's potential as it exists already.
Yeah, and I think what you said to me the other day, because I got back into a platform program I haven't done in a while, was like the first time you do something, your body is going to probably have a different experience. The second you do it again for the second, third, fourth time, it's going to be more used to it. It's going to be accustomed to it.
Absolutely. The repeated bout effect is very real. That's why like the DOMs happen often when the first time you do something in a long time.
Sure.
And then just as it pertains to, strength gain in general, regardless if you're new or experienced, your relative gains, it's going to take a number of weeks to see any real kind of substantial strength gains. And this could be something like 4 weeks for a brand new individual, but it could be something like 8 to 12 to 20 for somebody that's been doing it for a very long time. It's much harder the longer you've been doing it.
Sure. And just maybe I'll ask it now and try to steer us this way for the other topics, but where does just general consistency play into all of this? Because I think a lot of times we do have student athletes that are like, well, I lifted for 4 straight weeks, but then they took 2 weeks off because they went on vacation or did different stuff. I think sometimes we look at the bigger picture of, well, I've done X amount of workouts, but how does doing it consistently week over week obviously play a big role in it, or is it not as much?
Yes, and this is kind of one of those caveats I wanted to hammer home at the beginning and throughout, is that when we say 4, 8, 12 weeks, we don't mean in aggregate. Like in the course of a year, getting 12 weeks in. That's not what we're talking about, because your body will adapt to the stress that's placed upon it or the lack thereof. So if you work out for 4 weeks, you might begin to start seeing some adaptation, but then if you take 2 to 3 weeks off, it will begin to reverse.
Yeah.
So when we say 4, 8, 12, we're talking about 4, 8, 12 consecutively. And again, just to hammer home, you're only going to increasingly gain strength or drive adaptation if you are progressively doing more, whether that be weight, reps, or volume, than you did previously. If you do the same workout, the same reps, the same weights, and it never changes, you will only ever get to the point where you are capable of that, and it will no longer stress your body, and you won't continue to drive any adaptation. So we're talking about consistent and progressively overloaded, and that doesn't mean just throwing tons and tons of weight on every time. It just means always incrementally progressing over those 4, 8, 12, 20 weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good probably starting point for strength. And we can transition, like we said, sort of going from thing to thing. And the next one that is probably relevant, especially to more of the athletes that are looking, and we talk about sprinting and speed all of the time, is, that adaptation of getting faster and getting, that speed development under the way. So how does that one play into effect? Is it a similar thing when it comes to 6, 8, 12 consistent weeks of constantly your body getting more used to whatever you're doing, or is it different in this context?
Well, thankfully, for many of us, speed is actually somewhat on the opposite end of the spectrum in that it is, when we're talking running speed, and there's a lot more to this, so I'll kind of try to explain with slight bullet points after, but it's more of a central nervous system, neuromuscular coordination element or piece of training or approach, and your body is able to basically adapt to that far quicker than something that's going to require like connective tissue, muscular change, so forth and so on. So you will actually, engender some sort of adaptation in response to pure speed, and I'm talking more along the lines of, straight up running and speed, although obviously swimming or other, monostructural, that you'll actually start to see return on investment far quicker in the days to a week or two type of adaptation window. Now, again, there are layers to that because at some point you will top out at your, call it physical potential of speed until you increase your strength, which obviously takes a bit longer and you need to be doing the speed on the side of it. But it's the reason why, they're kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's also the reasons why that it takes longer to gain strength, but it takes longer to lose strength without doing anything. It takes shorter amount of time to get up to your potential in pure speed, but it also drops off far quicker if you don't use it because your body is quicker to adapt or kind of adjust to the stress of something that's more central nervous system.
Yeah, and you kind of referenced my sport of swimming, but it's funny because we always talk about if you take a couple weeks off, especially from that speed style stuff, the second you go to do it, it's almost like your body forgot how to do it. And it's just that, and I know that's probably not the most scientific way of approaching it, but it's like I literally my body does not know how to move this way right now.
No, and I think that's a phenomenal way to think of it because I was going to mention it was strength, but I just figured it wasn't worth it. We had kind of gotten over it. Your body is learning how and being familiar with how to do things. It's learning how to utilize the musculature, utilize the central nervous system at the right speed, the right coordination to make everything work. And when it comes to speed, you're not looking to move heavier and heavier weights. You're just looking to get closer and closer to your ceiling.
Sure.
So you can respond far quicker to true speed development than you can strength. But again, I think it's really important to remember that doesn't mean that all you should be doing is speed, and if you do 2 weeks, you're going to be as fast as you could be, and that's the end all. Because there's way more to speed than just sprinting or moving at your.
You have to develop the different pieces to it, like we've talked about,
right.
And that probably is a good transition to just quickly touching on power and understanding that power, like we've talked about, somewhat combines and builds from the other ones.
Yeah, I like to think of power as an expression of the combination of strength and speed. So you can improve your rate of force development maybe a bit quicker than you can your total force development, but the marriage of the two is going to require a bit longer of a development. So it probably trends more towards the weeks and months than it does a week or two.
Nice. Yeah. And I think that all puts it into good context in terms of strength, power, and a lot of that stuff is going on inside the body, right? It's just the stuff you talked about of neuromuscular and all of those different types of things. But that's not usually where the conversation drives from. A lot of times the conversation drives from well, I want to see the noticeable difference. I want to see my six pack. I want to see my, muscles busting out of my shirt, and I want to lose, fat and all of these other things. And how long do those, what those physical attribute or body composition adaptations take is often where the conversation actually probably starts.
Yeah, you're probably right. I'd say for 80% of the conversation I have, it's generally because of the eye test.
Yep.
Although to be fair, some athletes are looking for I want to feel faster, I want to feel stronger. But they're also some of the group that says I want to look a certain way because I think that's the expression of being faster, stronger, etc.
Sure.
So body composition's probably a really important one to understand. It's also probably the most unfortunate one in that it's a long slog, and anybody that's tried to change the way they look through diet and exercise knows how difficult that is. So when we're talking body composition, whether you're trying to gain muscle or lose body fat, it's measured in months, not days or weeks, like very much not days or weeks. Because, as we mentioned, sure, let's say you're looking to just gain muscle. We just talked about what happens when you work strength, you do resistance training. The first 4 to 8, maybe longer weeks that you engage in that type of activity, you are going to get stronger. But why are you getting stronger? It has nothing to do with the size of your muscles. It has everything to do with your neuromuscular control and the ability to perform the action. So you are not actually driving any sort of hypertrophy, which is the gain in muscle mass, in really your first maybe 2 months. So for athletes like my own football players that are looking to just get bigger, that's a fine goal, but understanding that it's going to take months of dedicated, consistent work.
Yeah, and I think we also often lose people within that first month or two because the patience goes away, or it's hard to stick with the routine because you want those quick results. And
overnight. Yeah.
And to hear that number of months is the part where, as coaches and teachers and even students, or like you said, even adults that want those quick fixes, have to understand like it will come, but we have to continue kind of that repetition and consistency, not just expect it to happen in a month. And if it doesn't, say, oh, it didn't work, and give up.
Right. And so it's going to take you not only months of consistent work, but as we've discussed in a lot of different places on our episodes, is that you'll also have to be pretty dialed in with your nutrition. And I don't just mean like types of food you're eating, but caloric expenditure, caloric intake, and so forth and so on, which leads me also to kind of the inverse of muscle gain, which would be fat loss. You can work out for 4 weeks, even as like a brand new person, and you're not going to see much change visually because it takes a long time to kind of create the, let's maybe say for fat loss, the caloric deficit to lose weight at a rate at which you can, 1, sustain, and 2, eventually shows visual signs. If you've talked with Rebecca a number of times, and she talks about, we're looking at minimum windows of weeks.
Sure.
Your caloric surplus or deficit in a day is not really all that important, rather your week or greater. So if we're only talking, you get to stack 4-week kind of buckets in a month, and maybe you lose a half pound to a pound of fat in each. That's not going to be visually apparent for quite a few weeks, if not more than a month at its most aggressive.
Yeah, and I think Rebecca, who's our platform nutritionist and kind of the expert in that, helps kind of illuminate that in a lot of ways, because as you just talked about, and now when I have friends who ask me, or, what does your, platform spin or take or anything else like that. But I think it's a great example because it also makes it easier and more palatable, I think, in a lot of ways, to know that like you don't have to be perfect every day. You don't have to live by this extremely regimented routine, but you do have to understand that that also means that like it's the long term, like how does your body see these changes week over week over week, not day over day over day.
Sure.
And I think sometimes we get pigeonholed, like I have to burn X amount of calories in a given day. I have to not eat X amount of calories in a given day. And we're not even talking about some of the other pieces that Rebecca goes into great detail about, but we take those numbers and we like hold them as facts without considering all of the other moving pieces around it.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, well, long story short, body composition is probably the longest of all of the adaptations in terms of seeing your gains. They're happening, right? Like there is a hypertrophic effect very quickly after working out, but you're not going to see that result. You're not going to actually see an increase in cross-sectional area of muscles for maybe 8 to 12 weeks. You're not going to see fat loss, even if you're in an aggressive 1 pound a week loss deficit, for at least 3 to 4 weeks, and that's the most aggressive. So It's about understanding that, again, consistency over kind of larger periods of time. And it's really important to know, because we've talked about this in a number of podcasts. You're either generally two buckets: somebody that is dying to get bigger or worried about getting bigger. And I think the important thing to note is that if you're worried about getting bigger, pump the brakes. Even if you're going ham on trying to get bigger, it takes months of concerted effort and work. And then on the other side, if you're somebody that's like dying to get bigger, fine, understand what that means and how long it's going to take, because if you bail out early, you're never going to see the result, because it's not aggregate. It has to be, I started now and I pushed all the way through until I started to see those gains.
Yeah, and I'm not even going to get down the road, because we've talked about it a few different ways, but like, again, back to the original point that you made at the top of this podcast is it also just depends on the individual, like, and talks about the experience level that you come into it with. Like, we haven't even really scratched at like puberty and all of the other things that could be driving some of this stuff, because some people will see really quick changes in a short span because they hit a growth spurt, or they're like just, you know, at that time in their like high school life, and then plateau, and they're like, wait, I got this like quick burst. Wasn't it always supposed to be that easy? Or all of those different parts where it's like, it's not always going to be the same, especially as you get older and it starts to kind of like flatten out. Cool. And I think that's probably a good one to just probably pause on. We could spend, and people have spent years talking about that and trying to figure it out. But I think the consistency piece that we keep going back to is a good one. The last kind of two things that we sort of talked about was just general conditioning. And we'll let you break it down, but aerobic and aerobic, we've talked a lot about what those buckets are. But we talked about how they're separate as well. Probably makes sense to start with aerobic, since that's, like we talked about, kind of like the baseline and the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always used to hear it takes 3 weeks to get it. It takes 3 days to lose it. And I know that that's, probably a little bit of a generalization, but that's what I always heard. Talk me through kind of that adaptation from a conditioning perspective.
Yeah, and I've used that kind of adage, and to be fair, probably is a slight over a generalization and in the bend of trying to dissuade athletes from getting away from things for too long.
Yeah, long vacations away.
Yes, but it's actually not way off. So I think this is important for whether it be athletic performance, whether it be general fitness, because we know the anaerobic and aerobic capacity, cardiovascular health and metabolic health is super important, whether you're concerned about performance or just general life. So aerobic capacity is something that I think is important for anybody, and most people would absolutely agree with that. When it comes to how long does it take to, quote unquote, call it just get in shape, and I mean from the aerobic style, think longer, slower runs, tempo type runs, that type of conditioning window, the longer, lower intensity continuous action, you are looking at something from 2 to 4 weeks minimum of, again, consistent work. Going out for a run once a week for 2 weeks is not going to put you in, quote unquote, aerobic fitness. But if you do it a few times a week consistently for 2 to 4 weeks, you'll start to see those gains. And this also is something that, like strength, because it takes a bit longer in the world of, call it, conditioning, the windows are a bit longer. You think of it like a month maybe, or 3 weeks to a month. It also disappears a little bit slower. So as long as you're doing something to keep it up, it's not going to disappear. It's not going to stick around for much longer than a couple of weeks without doing anything. And it also is wildly dependent, like strength, on what your training history is. If you're somebody that has been in shape, that has done that before, that has been at a certain level, you'll get back to it quicker.
Sure.
And that's not just because muscle memory or like, oh, you were good at it once, you're good at it now. There are things happening at a cellular level that haven't completely disappeared. So you're starting at a higher level than somebody else might be. So getting back in shape for you versus for me is probably a lot quicker. So general aerobic, you can think of it, I think, as probably the 3 weeks. I would honestly err on the side of 4 in the world of, if you a lot of the people that ask that question haven't done much when they're looking to say, like, how long is it going to take to get me in shape for X sport, for the first time, for just general health? If you're asking that, you probably haven't done much lately.
Right.
So I would call it 4 weeks.
Err on the side of longer side,
yes.
yeah. If you've been doing something, for example, like I'm looking at getting ready for a swim in June. I know that I have general kind of like health and wellness shape, and I want to get ready and start to swim a little bit more so I can enjoy the swim.
Yeah.
But I'm not like getting off the couch into nothing. I know that I have a little bit of something,
Right.
and I think it would take me probably a little bit less than 3 weeks to get back into what I feel comfortable of, like my aerobic swimming shape.
Right, and honestly, that's a phenomenal example, if you will. Let me kind of just dive down the rabbit hole. Like, that's a great example that illuminates a lot of things. You're swimming on, June 6th. You have a slightly higher starting point than most, and the bulk of what gains you'll see will happen within that, call it like 4 weeks. So maybe you start in May, and you'll probably be exactly where you'd want to be for just completing the task and being comfortable or being prepared. That being said, if you wanted to improve the time that you hit for said swim race by X percent, and it's up towards your kind of like best ever, that might take, instead of 4 weeks, 4 to 6 months, because at a certain point the gains slow, and it becomes harder and harder to do, and it takes longer and longer to create that response. So you can kind of then assess, well, how much do I want to invest in this? How much do I care about from a 1 hour time to an hour or 55 minutes or an hour and 5? Like, that window becomes very wide.
Yeah.
So 4 weeks or so for aerobic, I think, is a fair rule of thumb.
Yeah, and I think that example is one in which, again, like a lot of times I think certain students or athletes even will come from like one sport to the other. Like they'll be like, I just got out of this sport, I have a couple weeks off and I just kind of want to chill. Well, I'll be good. Am I going to lose it? Those types of things. Mm-hmm. And that's where those conversations, again, become contextualized around what have you been doing and what are you getting ready to do? Like those are the two questions that often come up. And then we'll close probably with, before we wrap it all up, with anaerobic capacity. We had lots of podcasts on aerobic, anaerobic, the thresholds, things like that. But is this one different in terms of like taking to like see its potential in adaptation versus losing it? Or
there is, and I will just caveat yet again by saying that even within anaerobic, there are quite a few layers to that, and I don't think it's worth getting into because there's just not enough difference for the audience we're talking about and the level of experience, etc. So when I think about anaerobic, we're working at much higher intensity. You're looking at oxygen debt. You're not able to just get the huff and puff and continue for longer periods of time, whether that be all-out training or sprint repeats or whatever. This is actually, call it maybe half the amount of time that it would take to get into really great aerobic, or not really great, to get to that aerobic capacity improvement or gain, to feel it. You're going to feel it and see the adaptation in probably more like 2 weeks. And that's obviously important to know for athletic purposes and everything else. But again, know that there's overlap. We've talked a lot, a lot of different instances where aerobic and anaerobic aren't unrelated, and they do interplay. So thinking that you can get ready for a sprint-based sport by just doing sprints for 2 weeks before your season and not having done any aerobic is that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But knowing that it's not just as general and black and white as we're painting it right now, but if you're doing all these things and you're focusing on some anaerobic type of capacity training, it's going to happen a little bit quicker than, say, aerobic. Because if you think about it, it's not as dominated by, or not at all really dominated by, heart and lungs. It's more central nervous system, metabolic process, and your muscular system, right? You're talking closer to speed and power than you are aerobic capacity.
Yeah.
And obviously, again, all of these overlap, so it's not surprising that it's not as quick as speed, it's not as long as aerobic, it's somewhere in the middle. So you can think of that as a good rule of thumb, maybe 2 weeks. I, again, err on the side of maybe call it 3, which again is why not say 3?
Yeah, prepare.
And I think, the whole 3 weeks to gain it, 3 days to lose it probably encapsulates a lot of what will matter to athletes, because it's going to take at least 3 weeks to get all of the things you want conditioning, speed, maybe it happens quicker, but you're going to continue anaerobic right right around that window. Aerobic might take a little bit longer or just about that time. And then the moment you stop doing those things, speed's going to drop off pretty quickly. Aerobic a little bit shorter, anaerobic somewhere in the middle. But it's a good kind of general rule of thumb, a good window of kind of understanding.
Perfect. That's probably it for us in terms of like the specific topics. I think we've kind of said it throughout, but to me, like the consistency aspect, I think is probably the biggest selling point, and understanding that a lot of times we're talking about, hitting something really hard and buying in and knowing that this is like what I'm going to do, and then it's hard to maintain. Like we talk about it on the nutrition side of things a lot with Rebecca, is like, what can you do well consistently? Like you're never not going to eat another piece of ice cream or chocolate or anything again. So why even set that as the expectation?
Right.
Set yourself up with things that you can manage long-term consistently. That's going to help you get to where you want to go. Maybe it's not ice cream it's not ice cream every single night if that's what you've been doing. Like modify and adjust rather than make these absolutes that you have to like live and die by.
Sustainability is key for all of this. If you want to achieve a goal, we know that in any phase of life, it's got to be something that you're willing to do regularly. And if it's hot for 2 weeks and then falls off,
sure,
it's just not going to get much. So, bottom line, any of these kind of questions of, how long will it take to see? Patience, urge patience and understand that we're operating in the world of weeks and months, not hours, days, and weeks.
Yep.
And I think also is to illuminate the different things that can happen over what time periods, because, an athlete says, well, I only have, 4 weeks before the season. Why bother? Because, I know it takes 12 weeks or more to really gain significant strength and size. Yeah, maybe, but it's going to start you on that journey, and you're also going to see good, maybe neuromuscular adaptation as well as maybe speed, conditioning, and you're going to be better prepared for your sport than you would have if you did nothing for 4 weeks. And if you then continue stuff in season, or when you get back to off season, again, you're a little bit ahead of where you would have started having done nothing. So it's not something that should be scaring people away. It's just an understanding of how long it takes and then utilizing that to your advantage when and how you can.
Yeah, and I think just like we've said throughout this, tempering expectations, because I think a lot of times it leads to frustration. Like, you see a lot of people kind of slamming their head against the wall saying like, how come I haven't seen the difference yet?
Yes.
Or I wanted to get to this point by this day and I haven't. Like, it doesn't mean you're totally off course. It just means the course is a little bit longer than you expected.
Absolutely. And, you can set, your progress doesn't have to be eye test. The progress can be, did I complete 4 weeks worth of workouts? Okay, next month, did I complete 4 weeks? And then you begin to see what's coming with that, and then you don't really even need to worry about setting the goal of just, did I complete my workouts? It's, what am I getting out of it?
For sure.
So I think all of that context is important. The general perception is important, expectations are important, and progress tracking of any kind is important so that you can see and be motivated to continue.
Right, and a good point about what that progress is. If it's sometimes just actually working out consistently, that's progress in and of itself and makes a big difference. So that's a good place to stop. I had brought this conversation to the table, so I appreciate you digging into it. I think this is a cool one to talk about, especially because of how relevant it is, even with all of the caveats and kind of question marks around it. There's a lot to take from this in terms of kind of having the right conversations and, again, setting the right expectations along the way. So we appreciate everybody for tuning in to another episode of Chalk Talk with Coach Brez, our EDU style podcast where we kind of dive into a specific topic. If there are other topics that you want to hear us talk about, please reach out to us, shoot us an email. We're always happy to kind of dive into what sparks your interest as coaches, teachers, or students or athletes that are listening to this as well. So thanks again, and remember, at Platform, it's always in pursuit of better.